Welcome back to the FinsFocus podcast. We are back. Tyler and I are back to, recap the season, recap the press conference by Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier, and obviously Tyreek Hill. But before we get into that, how are you doing, Tyler? It's been a little bit of time.
Doing good on the non-Dolphins front. Moved back into college. Got some posters now in the background. Just trying to get back into the swing of classes and everything. But on a Dolphins front, I think we all know it couldn't be going much worse. Now, after the season, obviously not making the playoffs when we were looking at this team as one with potentially Super Bowl aspirations, that's a disappointment. And then on top of that, these press conferences that we just got from a lot of these players and the coaching staff were not the best. So we're going to break some of those down, talk about where the hope for this team kind of is and what we're going to do moving forward.
Yeah, before we get into the press conferences, I just want your thoughts on the overall season. Again, it's been a little bit of time, and I figured we should talk about why the press conferences went as they did, and that's because the Dolphins finished 8-9, Tua missing 35% of snaps again. A lot of common problems that seem to not be fixed, but Stephen Ross said that they'll be back. They've already done the press conference, so that's where we're at now. Tyler, where are you? And overview the season for us, at least on your thoughts, just to recap that portion.
This team seemed like that they never just got back to where they were in 2023. Like, I know that we talk about, hey, could we marry, parts of the offense from 2023 and 2022, or the defense from this year, the offense from another year. And it just seemed like this year, the offense specifically never got around to being back where they were. There were times where it seemed like Tua and the offense had taken a step. But when you're looking at week 2 on a short week and you're already missing your quarterback for a month of the season due to a concussion, you're getting blown out by the Bills at that point. Even before Tua goes out, it was pretty early in the season where I started losing hope that this team could be a Super Bowl contender. But then again, as the season goes on, you go from 2-6 and now you're, closing in on 500 and you're thinking, hey, maybe this team can sneak into the back end of the playoffs and, maybe make a little splash the same way we think, almost every year now. But they didn't. They clearly were not a good enough team, like, all around, just to make that happen. Even if they made the playoffs, I don't know that a one-way ticket to Buffalo was really going to help us out. So, overall, not super happy, obviously. I think that kind of good that it went the way it did. I think that, there is a lot of accountability that needs to be taken from the coaching staff and the players. And I think seeing this team kind of blow up right in front of them could very much help. But it also could do what it's done for Dolphins teams of the past and just move them further down a rabbit hole where they're like, hey, if we fix these 2 things, we'll be just fine.
Yeah, 100%. For me, again, like you said, we start 2-6. Again, the Tua injury happens at the beginning, and then you get back to 8-8, and you're thinking, if we can sneak in, look what the Cincinnati Bengals just did when they were the wild card, went all the way to the Super Bowl. Didn't win, but I think all of us would take a Super Bowl appearance. So you see what happens there. And then obviously Tua gets hurt again at the back half of the season. And you kind of saw that a lot of people like to make the entire team about Tua, which quite frankly is annoying and tiresome and honestly lazy at this point. You saw when Tua was not playing, or even when he was, there's a lot of problems on this team that have nothing to do with him. Obviously some are caused by him and do have to do with him. He's the quarterback of the team. That's probably the most important position in sports. So again, those things go hand in hand, but you saw that this team is not like a quarterback away, or that's not Tua's. You can say Tua's not the solution, whatever you want to say. I'm not here to get into that, but he definitely wasn't holding them back because there was a lot of flaws on this team, and there are a lot of holes on this team that just need to be fixed. And the thing is, it's not like the Dolphins have some huge war chest of resources that you're gonna have to do that. You're gonna have to find some seals in contracts, like you did with Jonnu Smith and Aaron Brewer and Jordan Brooks, which those were great signings, but you also had some misses like Jordan Poyer and people like that. So they're going to have to do a better job. And listen, it's the same core. It's Tua as your quarterback, McDaniel's your head coach, and Chris Grier is your general manager. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the core of the team. Like, that is what this team is going to be about and what this era of Miami Dolphins has been. And it seems like we're riding with them again, obviously due to the contract extension for Tua, the contract extension for Mike McDaniel. And then if you're going to keep Mike McDaniel, you're not going to force a new general manager to keep a head coach. Therefore, Chris Grier is here to stay, and he has been the king of inconsistency. So we'll see what happens this upcoming year. But speaking of the upcoming year, we got to hear some of their thoughts on how the season went and where they're looking forward. after watching their press conference yesterday. So Tyler, where are we at for the kind of the whole press conference? Then we'll get into some of the specifics.
There were parts of the press conference I liked, parts I didn't. I know there were a lot of people on Twitter who were either completely one way or completely the other way, and I think it does fall somewhere in the middle. I think Mike McDaniel's understanding of things, the fact that he's sort of figuring out what's working and what's not working for accountability, I think is a big deal, but also the fact that it seemed like a lot of the issues that this team had, they were pinned on players by Chris Grier and by Mike McDaniel, and I think if you're going to be such a player-driven head coach and a player-driven locker room guy as Mike McDaniel, I think you need to be showing a bit more loyalty to your guys. And I think that's kind of where I fall on the press conference in general, is this team kind of needs a culture shock. They need a shift. They need something that is going to shift the way we look at the Miami Dolphins, because let's be honest, the stars and scrubs kind of roster that they put together this year, where you have so many guys that you paid a ton of capital for, like Jalen Ramsey, Tyreek Hill, Bradley Chubb, 2 out of the 3 of those guys, I would say, were failures this season. In Tyreek Hill and then Bradley Chubb, because he didn't play. And I'm not saying whether or not you got to keep or get rid of those guys. We're going to discuss Tyreek later. But I think we have to get to a point with this Dolphins roster where we're starting to look at the value buys. Where can you go make money over the margins? Where can you start playing money ball and say, hey, we can go get this guy for $3 to $4 million. Maybe he'll play like 6. And then we can go spend that other 10 that we could have spent, combined on one player. We can go spend it on 2 or 3 other players. And I think that's kind of where this team needs to go. And, I know that I'm getting into the weeds of things, but overall, just looking at the press conference, I thought they were putting a little bit too much blame on those players. And then if they're not going to go out of their way to try to resolve things on their end, it's all for naught. But I do think there's going to be a shift in how Miami looks at player acquisition, because it has to change.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this press conference, because I agree with you. I will say, I thought, and like there always is, there's going to be coach speak, general manager speak. That's always going to happen. I mean, they're not going to just tell us everything, but I did think they were very real in this press conference. The issue is, I don't know how responsible and how actions mean louder than words. When Chris Grier talks about certain things, are you actually going to do it, or are you going to do what history says you're going to do? So that's where I'm at with the press conference in terms of what they said. I also think that they're in a place where they have to make change, because they're on the hot seat now. Whether Stephen Ross is going to say it or not, there's no way where if this goes poorly again that they stay. If they do, then that's an even bigger issue, and that's something that we can't even get into. But they're clearly on the hot seat. There clearly needs to be a change. And like you said with the culture, something needs to change with this team, just because they said it themselves, 8-9 is not good enough. And for this team that, again, like you said, before the season had Super Bowl aspirations, when this happens, you have to make fundamental changes, which you would think would happen with, firing the head coach, firing the general manager, which didn't happen, which I'm not overly upset about, but I'm also not ecstatic about it either, and that's never where you want to be. I do think that there is some positives to take from the press conference too. A lot of people are just making it overtly negative, or again, like you said, you have the homers who are just saying everything's great. I want to see actions on what they're saying. And speaking of, let's get into the first thing that they talked about, and the first major thing that they talked about at least, which was the Tyreek Hill situation. We'll get through that, and then we'll talk about Chris Grier's comments on Tua, just because I think those are the 2 main components of the press conference. Then we can get into the specifics of the offensive line and all those things that happen in the back half. But one of the first things that was talked about was their thoughts on Tyreek Hill's comments, where Tyreek Hill essentially said, I'm out. He's posting the AB meme on Twitter, and I know a lot of people made a big deal about that, but Tyreek likes to have fun on Twitter, and that's a whole thing. But in that press conference where he said, as a captain of the team, but then goes on to say, I'm out, and basically says he doesn't want to be a part of this team anymore. What are your thoughts on that? And then what are your thoughts on Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier saying that they both talked to him after, and that he didn't request a trade, but also that he didn't pull back any of his comments either? Where do you stand on that whole situation?
I honestly feel that they handled that part of the press conference as good as they could have. I mean, you're not going to say our number 1 player, the guy that we're kind of known for having at this point in Tyreek Hill, who's kind of become the face of this franchise over the last 3 years. That guy wants out. We're going to trade him. We are going to put him up, please make offers on him, because that's just not how good business is run. Like, you're not going to go say, hey, this asset's on the market, because that's naturally going to lower the price. Do I think that he requested a trade and I think that they're lying? No, I think that they're telling the truth. I think that he probably did say, hey, I was a little emotional, but I don't necessarily backtrack on what I said. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, not necessarily backtracking, but I think there could have been productive conversations. The biggest thing with me is I do think he's probably gone. I just can't see a world where the team goes forward with Tyreek Hill. I think that there are players on this team who say, hey, we got to deal with the guys who want to be here. And I think it's in the best interest of Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier to deal with guys who want to be on this roster and who are truly loyal to the vision. Because regardless of if they're on the hot seat, if they're not, I imagine this team is going to try to backtrack a little, to rebuild through the draft a little bit more. We've talked about it. We're going to probably see a little bit of a reset year next year. And that requires, like I said, putting together draft capital, putting together draft classes. And that's naturally, if they're successful, going to extend the time that both of these guys are employed by the Miami Dolphins. So I think Tyreek probably gone. I think they're going to use whatever assets they can get right now, potentially draft some players, use that cap to have for 2026, because I know that you don't get a ton right now, and just see what they can get for him. I think he's probably gone, but like I said, I think it was handled decently well.
I think what they said was handled decently well, like you said. I just think there's definitely... I'll give you two things. If he comes back, I think obviously Mike McDaniel's offense can stay similar. He can do all those motions and, run a motion from across the field and still run a deep post or deep hook or deep curl route, which a lot of other receivers just don't have the capability to do. And then also, obviously, you have Tyreek Hill. That's an immense talent. I think they're trying to probably figure it out. But like you said, when he says, I want out, when he is presumably the person who isn't showing up on time, and that's clearly what they're alluding to. I'm not here to confirm or deny that or anything. I don't know what that's about, but clearly he has feelings about wanting to be out. And like you said, we want players who want to be here. I'm sure they want players who want to be there because that's how you win. And I think if you move on from him, that forces you to change the culture and the offense, which have been problems this year. That forces you to change the offense. You can't rely on Tyreek Hill to do the things that he does. Therefore, you have to become a little bit more powerful. You have to become a little more reliant on pass catchers that aren't just pure finesse, speed, small players. Therefore, I think it is better for Tyreek Hill to leave for everyone, to be completely honest. If Tyreek Hill wants out, if you don't want him to be there, it works out in pretty much every way other than his contract, which you extended and restructured again at the start of the season for really, who knows what reason? I guess Tyreek Hill just said, hey, I'm still the best in the world, which he's not anymore, by the way. And therefore, they restructured it, gave him the extra guaranteed money. Now, if you can get a team to eat some of that money, if not all of it, probably not all of it, but some of it, I think you do that. I think that forces you to change the culture of the team, the way the team plays. And again, you can have a guy who comes in and guys who come in to replace what he does. And then also, you get rid of, a guy who clearly doesn't want to be here. So I think there's definitely a bunch of different ways this can go. I can see Tyreek Hill still be on the team, being happy. I can see him being here begrudgingly. I can also see him going very easily. So everything's on the table, and it's up to Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel to decide what's the best for this team.
Yeah, and as for, I think you nailed it right on the head there. And I think regardless of if Tyreek Hill is on this team or not, there are two things that are definitely true. One, what Tyreek Hill said definitely put a little bit of like a stink on this team. Like, definitely is something that needs to be addressed in front of the team, in front of everybody, because if it's not, it's going to become an elephant in the room. It's a big problem. What happened, regardless, I'm not saying he said anything wrong. I'm not saying that the coaching staff is wrong. I'm just saying it's a big deal. It is an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed going into next season. And then number two, the thing with Tyreek Hill being on this team, I think the biggest part of this, whether he's on the team or not, is the same thing we talked about with Connor Williams last offseason. You need to find a way where if this guy is here or not, you are not revolving your entire offense around a specific skill set. It can't just be the pre-snap motion and the timing in the way that Connor Williams had it when he was the center in Miami, and then he gets kicked out of the lineup because he gets injured. Somebody else has to come in, I think it was Liam Eichenberg, to play some center snaps, and all of a sudden you have no continuity on offense. You can't get to the line on time. You can't ID protections. You need to have a plan in place for depth. And whether or not Tyreek's on this team, I think there needs to be a way where you can play without him. We've seen that Tua's numbers are not bad when Tyreek Hill is off the field. They've been really good at times. But still, I think his skill set is one that Mike McDaniel, when he's on the field, when Tyreek is on the field, utilizes so heavily. And it leads to Tyreek not being able to play every snap of every game. It leads to him getting hurt. It leads to him getting tired. And we get to the point where it's like,
it's almost
why
a
isn't
detriment.
Tyreek Hill? Yeah, and it's like, why isn't Tyreek Hill on the field on 3rd down and 11? And it's like, well, because you ran him into the ground on the 2 plays before that, and now he's exhausted. So I think this is a thing that we kind of hoped Miami would do this year. We hoped that they'd lean more on their players rather than leaning on these skill sets that if their players are out of the lineup are, just absolutely. We would hope that they would lean more on what they have on the field, not just those stars, like being able to scheme around who's on the field, because you're going to have injuries, you're going to have problems. And the Dolphins of 2024 show that they cannot scheme around when their best players are out. Tua goes out and they are awful. You lose guys like Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, and you can't replace them on the offense despite having so many weapons. The biggest thing for this team is that they have to be more sustainable, and they have to be able to be flexible, because it's the NFL, and Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier said it themselves. Everybody is going to get hurt eventually, whether it's serious or not. I guarantee you everyone on that roster is banged up. And if you can't deal with what those guys are going through and adapt accordingly, you're not going to have any chance of winning playoff games.
100%. I'm with you. And here's my thing. So with your second point, because we'll stay there, change the offense, all that. I want to go back to your first point, just because that was a big part of the press conference too, where they talked about accountability and how Mike McDaniel needs to change the way that he, disciplines players for being late, about how players have to show up, be professional, and all those sorts of things. Usually fines, I would say, do the trick, but Mike McDaniel said that falls on him as the head coach. He needs to find a way to get players to be bought in. And a lot of that is just them wanting to be there and playing for that common goal of winning. I think sometimes that can be difficult just because of the location that we're in. Like it's Miami. But I think if you get the buy-in, like you saw from guys like Zach Sealer talking, and like he's not being paid extravagantly, but Manny wants to win, and you see that on the field. He's a guy who I would imagine is a captain next year. So those are one of those things that, you see guys talk like that, and you understand that there's definitely, like you said, an elephant in the room. And the accountability part, that does fall on Mike McDaniel. And to be honest, back to the Tyreek Hill point, how do you prove or how do you show that won't be tolerated without trading him? Because if you don't, you can just say, yeah, we'll tolerate it because you're back on the team and we need you. That's essentially what you're saying if you bring him back, is that, we need you, that we can't function without you. Therefore, whatever you want to do, skipping practices, whatever the case is, I'm not saying he does that, but whatever he wants, basically, he can do. So yeah. I think a great way to show that, hey, that's not going to fly is, hey, you're off the team and we want guys who are here who want to win. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the Tyreek Hill situation, accountability. If you have anything to say about that, let me know. But if not, I think we can get into... Okay, go ahead.
One thing quickly to touch on. I just wanted to say this because I think we're at a point where, we need to talk about what Mike McDaniel does, the way that the coaching style works. And you brought it up personally, whether or not Tyreek Hill is on the team. If he is, it kind of shows, hey, we don't like what you did, but we still need you. That's what the Dolphins have shown this entire time. Is, hey, Tua, you might not be worth $50 million, but when you're not on the field, we can't win a football game. Hey, Tyreek Hill, you might not be worth all this money. You might be a little bit of a head case sometimes. You might go off and do something that we don't necessarily agree with, but when you're not on the field, we're not winning football games.
Not play the second half of a game, even though you're not hurt or anything like that?
Pull yourself out of a game. And hey, you're not showing up to practice on time, which clearly there were stars on the team doing that. There were top flight players doing that, because you wouldn't be bringing it up if it was practice squad guys. It's clear there is not buy-in from everybody. But at the same time, the same players are being brought out onto the field every time, because Mike McDaniel has shown, hey, if we don't have this A, B, or C guy in the lineup, the offense is going to take a massive hit. The defense showed otherwise. They didn't have Jalen Phillips or Bradley Chubb the entire season. And they were still one of the better pass rush units in the NFL. They didn't have Kendall Fuller for the whole second half of the year. They're still making plays on the back end. Jordan Brooks didn't have a running mate for most of the season. You bring in Tyrell Dodson late and it works out. But like at linebacker, David Long had to get cut this year. That's how bad he was. And the team still is functioning on the back end. But with the offense and Mike McDaniel, there has been absolutely no ability to work around the players. If you sit there and you're like, hey, we're not going to find guys anymore, we're going to suspend you for a game, I have no faith that they're going to be able to figure it out. And that's why I'm not sure that they would even be able to do it. I wouldn't trust Mike McDaniel to go out of his way to suspend a player, not because of the fact that I don't think he has the guts or I don't think he's this macho man. I don't think you have to be a macho man to give a player a suspension, but I think you have to prove, hey, we can at least make it work without you because we have the guys that are bought in and I understand what I'm doing. They have to get back to that. And that's my biggest problem is you need to prove that you still can create a functioning, well-oiled machine, even if you're missing 1, 2, or 3 parts. It's extremely hard, but it's what wins Super Bowls.
Well, that's been the issue, and this is what I was going to say before and I actually forgot. So we go from Tyreek Hill having 2 straight 1,700-yard seasons. The first year, Waddle's still very much involved, but last year I think we can all say way too Tyreek Hill focused, way too Tyreek Hill centric, where if he's covered, season's over, game's over. And also you see a guy like Waddle who's extremely, extremely talented and completely underutilized last year. Even this year, of course, too, but he was dealing with his own injuries. But you see a guy who is completely way too much the focus of the offense, and that's one end of the spectrum. But then last year, again, he doesn't get to 1,000 yards, which, to be fair, he should be upset about. There's no reason a player as talented as Tyreek Hill should not be even eclipsing 13 to 1,400 every single season, even if he's aging or whatever the case. You can see he still got it. So to me, definitely he has a reason to be mad. But again, this goes back to our original point where Mike McDaniel has not found a way to mesh the offense in terms of making it balanced. And that comes with having depth. That comes with not relying on a guy like Tyreek Hill that much for your offense. It comes with having a reliable wide receiver 3, which we haven't had. Malik Washington filled in that role at the end of the season, but at the beginning, you're hoping and praying that Odell Beckham Jr. might be able to be that guy just for him to get cut later on in the season. So finding that balance and finding that depth has been, the issue on the offensive side of the ball. Now, the reason that's been a problem is because Tua Tagovailoa is now making $50 million plus a year, and he missed some games. And Chris Grier, to my surprise, came out and said it's not acceptable and that, he can't do that, which is great. And I love that. And Tua needs to learn from that, which is awesome. They also said he's still our guy, which obviously they extended him. So what else are they going to say? But I'm glad that Chris Grier did make it a major focus and a major point to say, hey, we expect more from Tua to protect himself, and we expect more to Tua to be on the field because of that. And again, speaking of Tua, the backup quarterback goes hand in hand with him as your quarterback. It's nice to know that Chris Grier said, that's a position they'll be looking at in free agency and the draft, just because clearly there needs to be a plan in place, just because even though I really thought that Tua could stay healthy, unfortunately he put himself in a bad situation at the start of the year, and I don't know what happened at the end of the year. I believe it was that hit against the Texans, but we don't really know for sure. But we know that hit happened against the Bills that he just can't do. And honestly, next year, if he avoids that one hit, you're probably okay for the whole season. Now, I know that's ifs and buts and all that stuff, but to be fair, if he just slides because he'd already picked up the first down, we're pretty much good. But he didn't do that, and that's where the issue is. And Chris Grier called him out on it directly, and that's a guy who, he gave him that $50 million. So it was nice to hear that. But I hope they're accountable to, bringing in a reliable backup. But it was nice to hear that about the quarterback position. So what are your thoughts on Chris Grier's comments at the press conference?
I do like holding Tua accountable for his decision making because of the fact that it is a question mark. It is something he has struggled with mightily. He is a very poor decision maker outside the pocket at times, and he lets it get him injured. It's like every single injury has been an extended play that he has not gone down for. He's gotten himself hurt because of it. My problem with the statements on the whole about the quarterback position is I think there needed to be more inward perspective on Chris Grier for him to look at himself and say, hey, yeah, sure, we don't want Tua doing that. I don't think the press conference is the place to call Tua out for doing that. I think that singles him out. And then when you look at the comments about the rest of the things that Chris Grier himself could do as Tua insurance, they were all a little backhanded. He brought up looking at backup quarterbacks last year. He said, we were in on multiple backup quarterbacks. They wanted to come here, but we didn't have the money. If they wanted to come here, they'd be on the roster. Like, you would go get that guy. You would spend the money. And then he goes and says, hey, Skylar Thompson, the reason that we believed in him, we really didn't get to see him in 2023 because Tua stayed healthy. That doesn't mean that you roll into 2024 with a guy who is a question mark and that you say that you believe in him when in reality you say 5 minutes later that you were in on a bunch of top flight backup
with Mike White being your competition. Like you said, he said, he won the competition against Mike White. Like, it has to mean something. Yeah.
And on top of the Mike White thing, just the fact that you're saying, hey, with Mike White and Skylar on the roster, we were still looking at other guys. That means that you're not happy with what's in the room. So why would you lie and say we're also confident in Skylar? Just sit there and take the L and say, hey, this didn't work. You can say, hey, I like what we found in Tyler Huntley. There were times down the stretch where he looked good, but he might not. You have to look inward. And it seems like they're only willing to dish it out when it's a star that they think can take it. When it's Tua and they say, hey, we don't like you sliding. But you won't come out and say, hey, we didn't like the job that our backups quarterbacks did this year. It wasn't good enough. When in reality, they were a much bigger issue than Tua when you talk about how they played on the field. Like, I understand Tua's decision-making, his injuries, all that. But when it comes down to pluses and minuses, X's and O's, points or no points, who played better? Of course Tua played a pretty good season, and the backup quarterbacks were awful. So you have to be able to look inwards and say, hey, that's our problem. And then again, with the offensive line, you don't bring up the fact, you're like, oh, I was waiting for you to bring up that topic. That's what Chris Grier said. He said something to the effect of, hey, I didn't expect this to wait this long for you guys to tell me. And then when discussing the line, he says something along the lines of, yeah, now that Kendall Lamb and Teron Armstead might be back, it's about time we address this line. It's like, now? Only because these players had injuries and they might not come back? It was a lot of projecting, and I didn't like the way that he was going about it. I thought there was better ways to look inward and say, hey, these are things we have to fix because of what was put in front of us, rather than projecting it onto some of your top guys.
And that's been a long-running theme with Chris Grier, is that he doesn't give up on his guys. He's a little stubborn in that way. We've seen it with Liam Eichenberg, where it's like, how have you not replaced him? But he's like, no, we trust him. We drafted him in the second round. God, when we traded up for that second-round pick, I was like, oh, here we go, Creed Humphrey to the bank. And then we drafted a Notre Dame offensive lineman, and I go, oh, Notre Dame, that's, there hasn't been a bad offensive lineman from there in a while. We got the one offensive lineman who hasn't succeeded. And you've seen that's been a consistent pattern of Chris Grier's, forcing guys to stay on that path and, keeping those guys in the lineup. If he's on the team next year, I'm talking about Liam Eichenberg, I don't think I'm going to watch, to be honest. Like, if he's starting, I tweeted at the start of this year, like, the fact that he's starting means it's over, which is true. But obviously, we're already at that point. That was the next thing that they brought up, was the offensive line, specifically the offensive guard spot. I think bringing in a swing tackle is definitely necessary, especially if you don't have Teron Armstead coming back, just because I like a guy like Patrick Paul. I like the upside. I also like Austin Jackson for the most part, but the issue is he's been injured, and Patrick Paul is a second year, quite raw player. So a swing tackle is definitely needed. And then obviously, man, you need an offensive guard. Guard play was a complete issue, and that was a reason that we didn't have success in the interior run game. Honestly, it was the reason this offense didn't have a lot of success as a whole. And having guys like Liam Eichenberg and Robert Jones fill those spots without a backup plan that was only, Isaiah Wynn, who didn't come back until so much later in the year, that's not good enough. Especially considering I actually liked Robert Jones as a backup in previous years. I thought, oh, maybe this could be the guy if he comes in and plays well. Clearly, that wasn't the case. And you have to have a better backup plan than that, especially considering, obviously, we don't have access to it. During training camp and all that, you saw that this is what he was going to be, and they still didn't bring anyone in. So that was definitely an issue. And then Liam Eichenberg, you knew that was always going to be bad. So to me, addressing the offensive line, which Chris Grier said he would, and said, they're going to definitely take a look at it. Obviously, actions mean louder than words. I would love to see it. I've been stating this for so long. The Miami Dolphins have not made the playoffs in 20 plus years. They haven't had an elite offensive line in 20 plus years. Those things are so consistent and go hand in hand with each other. So whether we trade Tyreek, keep Tyreek, rebuild, don't rebuild, retool, whatever, build an offensive line and you'll set yourself up for success. And the start of that is addressing offensive guard. And Chris Grier, has to do that. And he said he would, which is nice. We'll see if he actually does it. It was a little interesting that Mike McDaniel didn't really comment on that. Obviously, he comes from an offensive line background, and he did a good job with Patrick Paul. He's done a good job with Austin Jackson. It would have been nice if he could have pulled a rabbit out of his hat with one of those offensive guards, but clearly that didn't happen. We'll see if he can this year. But that's where they are with the offensive guard position. Did you have any thoughts on that part? Just because I definitely think it's probably the most important need outside of maybe safety.
I think it's a bigger need than safety, just because I think it's been a need for, since Dan Marino walked out that door. And since he'd late Dan Marino's career when they didn't have an offensive line and he was getting killed at times back there. But my point is, when I look at this team and I look at those offensive line spots and I look at how they've called plays, my biggest problem is that what Chris Grier says and what Mike McDaniel shows on the field are two different things. When Chris Grier says, hey, you guys are more worried about the offensive line than we are, and then Mike McDaniel goes out there and he's calling so many runs that are so reliant on perimeter blocks and outside blocking and tackle blocking and receivers and tight ends and not as reliant on offensive guard play, he shows, hey, I'm a little worried about running behind these guards because I don't trust them. If you're going to say, hey, you guys are more worried about it than we are, then pound the rock up the middle and prove it. Prove it. Tell me that your guys can block, because it's not necessarily that Liam Eichenberg and Robert Jones were terrible this season. Were they pretty bad? Sure, they were not great. But at the same time, they didn't give those guys that many opportunities and try to just establish an inside pound the rock run game. We were mad about how little we saw Jeff Wilson, how little we saw Jalen Wright get opportunities between the tackles, why Devon Achane is back there having to swerve guys left and right. They're doing too much with the movement stuff, with the trying to get tight ends to do inside out blocks. They aren't putting as much emphasis on the offensive line, which shows they are worried about it. And seeing Chris Grier say, hey, we're going to go after those guys, that's big, but I need them to back it up. Because we saw the Kansas City Chiefs, every team in the NFL. Listen to any other podcast in the league of a team that has a bad offensive line. I guarantee you at some point this offseason they're going to say what I'm about to say right now. The Kansas City Chiefs went into a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A Super Bowl. They were good enough to beat every other team in the AFC. And they got curb stomped because they didn't have the offensive line. What did they do? They threw everybody on that line under the bus. Threw that line out the window and said, hey, we got to fix this thing. We have to rebuild this thing from the ground up. You saw Joe Tooney come in, Creed Humphrey come in. They've got new tackles. They replaced almost everybody on that line.
Trey Smith. Oh, he's a free agent, by the way.
Trey Smith, too. And Trey Smith is a guy that 100% Miami should be looking into. They are, you just want to see a guy who's nasty. Look at that one Trey Smith clip that gets posted every year of him on the screen. But that's not the point. This team needs to overhaul it. It's not go out and get one guy like it was late in the offseason, late in free agency with Teron Armstead, who has been phenomenal, by the way. This may have been his best season in Miami. He was unbelievable this year. He was looking like Trent Williams. But it's not just hey, let's go draft Patrick Paul. This team needs to address swing tackle this offseason. They need to have a third option there, knowing that you're losing two guys that you relied upon. And they need a guy who they know can stay healthy at that spot. You have guard issues, go get 3 of them. It's not go out and get one guard and say, hey, we can fix this. It's not go out and go and get a center to replace Connor Williams, but not replace Robert Hunt. You have to go out and every single piece that you lose or every place that you think needs upgrading. I don't care that you want to spend $15 million at wide receiver. That money needs to go to offensive line. I'm tired of having fun little toys and not having the guys that can go make you pound the rock up the middle and give you that successful game that you're going to get in December and January. Because we can talk about the fact that, hey, Tua can't throw the ball in the cold, blah, 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 blah. The problem is this offense is so based around throwing the ball in the cold. We've never seen them go. The last time we saw them go up to Buffalo, win in that cold weather, and have an established run game was with Jay Ajayi in 2016 when he went for 200 to close out the season. That's the last time. And that team was the Unicorns. We call them that because it was the most they spent on offensive line in a long time. Go out and establish it. Go out and get good players. Go out and spend the money there. If you're going to have money, which Miami has the opportunity to with all these restructures, I know I've been freaking out on this podcast multiple times, but I will freak out if they don't go out and get some offensive linemen.
Yeah, shout out Kendall Lamb, by the way. Hopefully he's okay, but like, man, he was really good for us. Yeah, so definitely spend money on offensive line. Definitely address the offensive guard position. And this is the same thing like that we said with Tyreek Hill. If you address the offensive guard position and get some maulers, guys, just remember what you were watching when you saw Robert Hunt, because that's above average to elite guard play. Just watch. If you have that, guys, Devon Achane might be small. He can run up the middle. You can run up the middle. You can pick up those clutch, those so important third downs and fourth and shorts that could completely change what this season just was. If you address the offensive guard position and that's it, you still have the 2 garbage safeties on the back end. You still have all these issues, all these injuries. Tyreek Hill's not involved. If you have 2 guards, we might be looking at the playoffs right now. And I'm being so completely honest. You might be looking at the playoffs.
You have 2 guards and they trust the guards. Like,
yes.
Because I'm gonna be real. If you put, I don't know, like if you put Steve Hutchinson in at guard and you bring out, I don't know, bring 2 Hall of Famers out of retirement and put them in their prime at guard, it may not have mattered with this Dolphins team if they don't trust them. Because 100%. I'm saying, hey, it could change, but there's a reason that this year they didn't show any capacity to give those guards the trust that they were trying to garner. And like, 2 things need to go hand in hand. We need the Chris Grier vision of bringing in the guards, and we need the Mike McDaniel vision of here's how we're going to establish the damn ground game and actually get 3rd and 1s and not have to come out and empty every time we want a short yardage situation.
Yeah. Let's, on that note, let's quickly wrap up the offense just because halfbacks, I don't think there's much to say. Achane's awesome. Literally, he's the guy you build your offensive around. I don't think there's much to say about him. And then we'll get into 2 things which go hand in hand. Wide receiver 3 or 2 if Tyreek Hill leaves, and the tight end position. I'll start just by stating the obvious, and then you can kind of get into the specifics of, what we want and what we could maybe address in the offseason. Jonnu Smith was an awesome signing. He was everything that you imagined him to be with the yards after catch, being that reliable space eater, being the guy who you can give 50-50 balls to. He was awesome. He was incredible. And again, he lived up to the hype and then some with all of that stuff being in this Mike McDaniel offense. That's awesome to see. Now, going forward, we need a wide receiver 3. I'm going to mention Trent Sherfield just because that's the exact type of guy who you want. If you go back to when he was here, put up 400 yards, his career best season, he was awesome. Reliable run blocker. He made really, really tough catches consistently, and you could trust him on any down, in any situation, running any route. He was amazing. He was fantastic, and that's a guy who you need. And that's another guy who you signed for the minimum and got so much better play out of, and that's the type of guys, those are the type of guys you need to kind of fill out this offense, especially when you're paying guys like Tua and Waddle and all these guys big money. So that's one thing. Then also, you need to address the blocking tight end position just because Julian Hill, he's only regressed since his pretty good rookie year, and then Jerem Smythe, I don't think, has a place on the team just because his blocking has become less and less valuable, and his ability just to be a consistent receiver in the flat doesn't really mean anything when you can find that on the street. So those are 2 positions that you need to address, and especially if you move on from Tyreek Hill. A lot of people say you can go get a receiver. I think Jalen Waddle is an awesome receiver. You can put him in that X position. He's that talented. If you go out and get a do-it-all blocking tight end, you can run 2 tight end sets and be an offense that is reminiscent of, not the Bills because Josh Allen, but, they have Dawson Knox and Kincaid. They have those guys. You see the Chiefs, they're running with Noah Gray and Travis Kelce. A lot of offenses utilize that tight end as a wide receiver anyways, and that's what we're doing with Jonnu Smith. He might as well be a wide receiver. If you go out and get a tight end, you can honestly fill 2 roles at once if you go and do that. So that's one option. But that's the thing with this Dolphins offense. You have options. Maybe you don't go out and get that tight end, spend big money there because you have Jonnu. Maybe you keep Jerem Smythe and Julian Hill and hope that they can, get their money's worth with blocking. Or you bring in a guy for cheap who can block. But then you go and spend money for that wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 2 who is physical and can do all those things. So I think you have options, which honestly is great. You never want to be hamstrung to just one thing. That's when you get into really tough spots as a general manager. But that wide receiver 3, big, whatever you want to call it, that's an important piece to address.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and I think there are ways, like you said, that the team can go about this. You want to go more of the 2023 route with the Dolphins, and you want to have guys that you feel confident in blocking as tight ends, which is something that Mike McDaniel showed this year he wished he had as wide tight ends, and Julian Hill and Jerem Smythe. He kept running at them, and almost every time it was a disaster. And you want to go out and fix that? Go get yourself a normal wide tight end, a guy who can block. Go get somebody like that. But if you want to move more in the 2022 direction, which is a passing game for the Dolphins that we liked a lot, We talked about, the passing game from 2022, the run game from 2023. How do you accomplish that?
Those were the days, huh?
Okay, exactly. And it's okay to get lighter. That more in a Rams direction when you talk about teams that come out in the gun and pistol a lot and are going to have these big slot receivers. I'm okay with that. You're going to need to get at least one big body type receiver. I say most likely two, no matter what. And one of them should be a Trent Sherfield, Mac Hollins, big slot type of receiver, because what that allows you to do is, even though Mike Gesicki couldn't block in 2022, you could roll out a 5-man lineup out there of Tyreek, Waddle, Sherfield, Gesicki, and a back of your choice, and you knew that Trent Sherfield could give you blocking, Mike Gesicki was going to force another DB onto the field, and you were going to run against light boxes. That's what got them so many big ground gains that year. I know they weren't the best, and then on third downs in obvious passing situations, you had a guy like Trent Sherfield who could go box out over the middle. You had a guy like Mike Gesicki who could box out over the middle. That's what it's about. If you want to build that passing game and truly give Tua more options in those tight windows, which we've seen are throws he can make somewhat consistently, then go out and get him guys who are big bodies, because they're going to, as when it comes to receivers, that's going to force more DBs onto the field. And some of these wide receivers can block their tail off against DBs. But if you get a tight end, that's heavier bodies, and you're going to see probably a lot more zone coverage. And then you're going to need guys who can attack and find those zones. I think it comes down to what identity do the Dolphins want to represent, and that should be how they address free agency. Because I think you should go after either two receivers and one tight end if you want to establish that man-beating style passing game. And if you're going to try to go out of your way to, pound the rock, run these two tight end sets, then you've got to get two more tight ends and one more wide receiver. I think either way it's going to be
bring
two
me
and one
Maulers. I don't tight end, offensive guard. Bring me Maulers. That's what I need.
Bring
That's
me
what the
Maulers
team
at
needs.
receiver.
Bring me Maulers at receiver. Yeah,
blocks. I just want guys who can. I want guys where I am watching the
tape.
tape.
River
and I have to get up out of my
being
seat.
your best blocker, not good.
Yeah,
love the guy.
He was
not
that.
good.
When you're rolling out three wide receiver sets of Braxton Berrios, Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Waddle early in the season or last year, you're not getting a run play at those guys, and if you are, probably ain't working well. If you're rolling out a lineup of Trent Sherfield, Jalen Waddle, and insert big body X receiver here, if Jalen Waddle's your worst blocker of the three, I'm okay with that. Because 100%. The one thing I know about Jalen Waddle is that he is willing to block his tail off. Is he the best blocker? No. But if you go out and you get two other guys who can block, and you're running more of that outside stuff, that's okay.
And then he doesn't have to block. You're good. Decoy block,
Just stop putting guys in positions to succeed, or stop putting guys in positions to fail by using them to a skill set that doesn't make any sense.
100%.
That's it. That's what it is.
Yes, it's not that hard, guys. Just make us the GM. All right, no. So quickly, I would also say Devon Achane. You can see him. I think you can get him and Jalen Wright on the field. You can make Jalen Wright the primary running back and have Devon Achane operate as a receiver as well. So again, there's so many ways for this Dolphins offense to be fixed. Again, whether Tyreek Hill is here or gone, you can use Devon Achane more as a receiver, and then boom, use Jalen Wright as your running back, and then there you have your tight end, and that could be your set. There's so many ways to go about it. So just go out and do it. And it starts with getting Maulers on the offensive line. Speaking of the trenches, we had Anthony Weaver, Chris Grier, and Mike McDaniel talked about it. He's being offered head coaching jobs, but man, did he do a great job with this defense. Where are we at with Anthony Weaver and the defense as we start to wrap it up here soon?
I think Anthony Weaver did a fantastic job. Like I said, there were moments where you didn't have all the pieces in place. You didn't have all the pieces in place all year. You look at this team, if you look back at what Chop Robinson has become, you look at what Jalen Phillips has shown you he can be, and you look at Bradley Chubb's track record, that should be a top 5 edge rushing rotation in the NFL. At the end of the day, you were running Emmanuel Ogbah off that opposite edge, and Quentin Bell. They didn't have a second edge rusher for almost the entire season. You had Jalen Phillips for 2.5 games.
And he was so good. Oh my God, he was so good.
He was amazing. But I'm saying, you only had him for 2.5 games. And you had, a just starting to play NFL football Chop Robinson who was struggling for the first couple weeks of the season.
Especially in the run
at the end of the day, and you come down towards the back half of the season and you're seeing these guys start to progress, and you're seeing the way Anthony Weaver is generating pressures for everybody. Everybody's eating. Zach Sealer, Calais Campbell, Emmanuel Ogbah, Quentin Bell, Chop Robinson. All these guys are eating. Jordan Brooks is getting in there on pass rush reps because he's a killer at that. He was maximizing what was in front of him, especially in the front seven. And I think that is something that not a lot of guys can do right now in the National Football League. Vic Fangio, with the defense that we had, did not maximize that front seven. Were there times where everybody was hooping? Sure. But Jalen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, Zach Sealer, and Christian Wilkins should have scared teams to death, and they did not at the end of the day. So, and Andrew Van Ginkel and everybody else we had last year, and they didn't scare teams to death. So when it comes down to it, I think just like the way Anthony Weaver was able to maximize what he had, despite having a defensive personnel that, if you look at the back end, it got torched and then also injured. And linebacker, like I said, we couldn't find a linebacker 2 for half the season. He made chicken salad out of you know what, and did a really good job.
We can
doing
say
it.
We're far enough into the podcast. YouTube won't find out.
Well, yeah, but I'm keeping it PG here, folks. But at the end of the day, he did an amazing job. I think that genuinely, if he can put together a staff, he should be a head coach. And I don't say that about many defensive guys, because I truly believe the best way forward in this modern day NFL is to go get, offensive guys, because you can't replace an offensive guy, because he's not going to leave to become a head coach elsewhere if he's already the head coach of your team. But if an offensive coordinator has a good year, they're probably already a head coach somewhere else. So, I think Anthony Weaver should be on teams' radars. I think as bad as Miami's offense was this year, I think there are a lot of minds that could potentially be offensive coordinators again. Frank Smith, Darrell Bevel, these are guys who I think might follow him if he gets a job. He also has ties to Baltimore, so who knows what we see from there. And, I just think he's a lot better candidate than he's getting credit for. I see a lot of teams like Bears fans saying, "Ooh, Anthony Weaver, that would be really bad." But trust me, I really don't think so. I think he's a really good leader. I think he's going to be a damn good head coach someday.
Oh, he was awesome. Again, you laid it out perfectly. We literally did not have a defense outside of Jordan Brooks and Zach Sealer. I'm probably forgetting a couple guys, and Chop Robinson. And literally he put together a top 10 defense. When the defense was on the field a lot, they should have been tired. There should have been a lot going on. You had guys like Deshaun Hand playing meaningful snaps and playing relatively well for what he was doing, There were a lot of things that Anthony Weaver did well. And again, like we said, so many injuries on the back end or just poor play. And he still had us statistically playing at a top 10 level. So shout out Anthony Weaver for that. We know he has good relationships. That's not going to be an issue. We know, he can be a leader of men. So shout out to him, and I hope he gets a head coaching job. But if he doesn't, he can come here, get some continuity, and that defense talent-wise will be better next year. So you can only expect better things, just because I don't think it's one of those things where he can get figured out or something like that. He was very, very, very good as a defensive coordinator. So that was awesome to see. Getting into a little bit more of the players. Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
just last thing on Weaver, the biggest thing is he did all of this in a cave with a box of scraps.
In 1 year, yeah.
In 1 year. He Iron Man'd it, dude. He literally came out here, had nothing, and turned it into a defense that we were not very much scared of, especially against bad teams. And that's the problem. I know that the Jets had 2 good games, but Aaron Rodgers is going to Aaron Rodgers somebody. But there were a lot of bad teams throughout the season that Miami could have very well lost to. Like New England, the first time we played them, they lost to the Colts, but that game we shut down that offense. There were a lot of times where the offenses were just obliterated by this defense, especially bad teams, and that's what I love to see.
100%. So we'll get into this one player that Chris Grier was asked about, Javon Holland. He's a guy going into a contract year. He was a main talking point just because in a contract year, you usually expect the player to have their best season. He definitely did not. He regressed. And if anything, he's been regressing. And Chris Grier was asked about it. And honestly, it wasn't a resounding, we want him back. It was, we talked in the summer. We let it go for the season just to let it play out. And now we'll talk to him. I don't think he's going to be back, and I doubt that he is. But that was a guy who you draft, and again, in that 2021 draft with him and Jalen Phillips, you're thinking, wow, we did pretty well here. Now you're in a spot where Jalen Phillips has been injury prone, but he's been great when he's on the field. But now you have a guy who Javon Holland, who you're probably going to lose, and now you have to replace both safeties when you could have easily re-signed a guy like Deshaun Elliott if you wanted to, who, by the way, was completely correct in saying what he said. A lot of Dolphins fans got mad. He's right. Deshaun Elliott was right. This defense was soft. In the Packers game, they were soft. In the cold weather, they were soft. in normal games, they were soft. The tackling was soft. And Deshaun Elliott was right about that. And if you brought back a guy like him, if you brought back a guy like Andrew Van Ginkel, imagine what Anthony Weaver could have done with those two guys. And Andrew Van Ginkel, I don't really care about the Pro Bowl, to be completely honest. I think it's a load of shit. But he made it. Like, that's a pretty good thing for a guy who was a 5th, 6th round pick. Shout out to Andrew Van Ginkel. He definitely could have been so useful in this Anthony Weaver defense. And again, a guy like Deshaun Elliott, we missed him so much this year because last year, him and Javon Hall were playing like a top 10 safety duo. And I'm not going to lie, when Deshaun Elliott got injured, you really saw his value because our defense looked nowhere near the same.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's not much else to say. Completely agree. I think that, this year we were literally rolling out as the second safety, a rotation of Jordan Poyer, Marcus May, who got cut. There was some
Patrick McMorris
McMorris reps in there, I think. And then Javon Holland is the main safety who just, like you said, I mean, part of it might be the fact that he had nobody across from him playing another safety position, but this was the worst year of his career by far. And I mean, that's just another testament to Anthony Weaver, is the fact that this team was, I remember hearing on the Week 18 broadcast, the best team in the NFL at forcing throws short of the sticks. There's a reason for that, and it's because of how well they were schemed up. So, safety, number one spot you got to look in the offseason, probably going to need, I'm just saying, probably 3 of those guys. Because Javon Holland, very likely walking out that door. Jordan Poyer, if you re-sign him, I have no idea why. And then Marcus May is gone. Patrick McMorris, if you somehow believe in that, sure. But you're going to need to carry 4 safeties minimum on this roster. So you need to go sign 2, draft 1 minimum.
You can also sign a corner, move Ramsey back for a little bit. I know we talked about that. There's lots of options.
Yeah, we did. In our episode that is lost because we did it for the fun of the game and did not pull ourselves out in the fourth quarter. We talked about the fact that we could move Ramsey back to safety, which I think is inevitable. I think there's a world where those instincts back there, I said it on the last episode, he just seems like you're playing a Julio Jones Madden card at safety. Like he's a freak. So he'll always be good, is my take on Jalen Ramsey.
It's also why we extended him. A lot of people were like, oh, we're extending a cornerback into his not late 30s, but late 20s into his earlier 30s. He's not a normal cornerback, guys. That's not the issue. He'll move back to safety, and he'll still be a very, very key part of this defense. But also, speaking of, kind of similarly to Tyreek Hill, if you want to reset the clock a little bit and get assets back for him, I'm not mad at that either. I'm not saying that you should do that, and I probably wouldn't myself, but you definitely could. You definitely could if you want to reset that timeline, because you have that core of Tua, Waddle, JP, Zach Sealer. You have guys under contract that you can rebuild around that aren't that old. So it's kind of up to the Dolphins and Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel whether they want this year to be an all-in, shove the chips in, let's see what we can do, or for this to be a reset year and supplement ourselves for the future, and hopefully that they're there. But they have a lot of options. There's a few different ways they can go with Tyreek Hill and with the future of the team, and I'm curious to see what they do, just because it's not like they gave us a hint of what their plans are exactly. They gave us a few hints about what positions they're looking for, but that's pretty obvious to kind of figure out. I'm so curious to see where they go in terms of the build of this team.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think there's so many directions they can go. I think the number one way you should go is probably a lot of roster turnover. If this year is going to be a reset year, like we're saying, and we really don't think this team is going to be super great next year, you're just trying to kind of extract value, why not go all in on that? You haven't gone all in on anything. You didn't go all in on the rebuild. You didn't end up tanking the full season like you thought you would. You didn't go all in on, getting rid of players and bringing players in. I feel like this entire rebuild, there have been times where it's been just like, we had half a foot in the door, half the foot out the door. When Mike McDaniel got hired, it was, will they keep Tua, will they get rid of Tua? And they kept Tua, but at the end of the day, they just brought in some supplemental talent and said, hey, this roster can go win now, even though it clearly could not. And we're at that point where you have to do something drastic. They said that, Stephen Ross said it himself, and Stephen Ross doesn't come out and talk much, and he says, in his statement, we're not going to settle here. And I think that is something that really cannot ring hollow this offseason. You need to go out, need to find some players, need to find a lot of turnover in this roster and say, hey, we want guys who are loyal, we want guys who love football, we want guys who want to be here. And if we somehow, end up losing a few extra games next year, but we have more fun doing it and we show that the culture here is improving, that's more of a successful season. a 6-10, 6-11, and more of a success is a better season than 8-9 when your culture is shocked at the end of the game or at the end of the season. Like, and I know, are we looking? I don't think we're really looking at a team that's going to go 6-11 or worse than that. I think we're still looking at a team that could compete for the playoffs next year. But at the end of the day, it's not about. Mike McDaniel said this a million times. The results are not what matter if you can get the process right over time. We're not going to look back and say, look at 2024. Remember how garbage we were then? If we're in 3 or 4 years looking back and saying, hey, look at how Miami got it right in 2025. And that's pretty much what I'm saying. Now's a time where you can genuinely right all of the wrongs. You have pretty much a clean slate. You have an opportunity to wipe this slate clean, go back after it, and go create some hope for this franchise. So, we might be looking at the lowest point we've seen in the Dolphins rebuild in quite some time, but that means the only way to go is up, hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see what we end up doing. All right, so before we get to our last segment, and I'll go first just because I'm kind of springing this on you. Of all the pending free agents, give me one that you think the Dolphins should sign. I'll go first. Justin Reed, safety from the Kansas City Chiefs. I think he fit in so well in this Baltimore Ravens defense. I think he can do everything, and he's great in coverage. I just think that's a guy who can bring some Super Bowl experience, especially if they can go out and win another one. That would be my perfect player to add to this defense. It's a position of need. It's a guy who shouldn't cost an incredible amount. I don't think it's going to be some extravagant Xavier McKinney type safety deal. It'll probably be in like the $8 to $10 million range if I had to guess, maybe even more. But if that's a guy who comes in that's not too expensive, that's a guy who I would want personally, just because I think he's a guy who can really change not only the defense, but the culture, like we were talking about. You haven't heard anything about him being a head coach or anything like that. Like, I think he can only help the defense on and off the field, and that's a guy who I would bring in if it was me. I know I put you on the spot, but I'm sure you've had some guys on your mind. Give me a couple names.
Honestly, I don't have much. I'm kind of looking right now just to see like who's coming up, who's going to be a free agent.
That's good podcasting, guys. Spring stuff on your co-host. That's what you do. I'm telling you.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I think there are like a lot of players in this class that you could go after. I see a guy like DJ Reed from the Jets who is going to be a free agent. If you're going to move Jalen Ramsey back to safety and, you're looking for a nice physical corner, that's a guy who I'm always looking at. Rasul Douglas, I know he's aging, but he's been phenomenal in Buffalo. I don't know why I'm only looking at corners. I'm seeing other names.
Corners from the AFC East.
Apparently. Yeah. Jawan Johnson, I think, is a good tight end option. Again, kind of more of a pass catcher, but he has some blocking prowess. Just looking through this list, there are a lot of guys. There are a lot of guys where you could say, hey, there could be some good Dolphins on this list. I'm seeing Jeremy Chin down here, another guy who's extremely versatile.
Super young. Can't believe the Panthers got rid of that guy. Can't believe that.
Yeah, and he's 26. He's almost 27 right now. Another guy you could probably go get down the roster. As we get more into the offseason, and I have more time to look at these guys, I will 100% have a deeper list, but those are a couple of guys that come to mind. I think it's just an offseason where you could definitely see a lot of these guys getting some work from Miami and getting just trying to look for wherever you could find a value deal across the board. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm looking at this list right now and I see a lot of guys who could be very good players. So yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, sprung it on me a little bit. I don't exactly have my free agency breakdown quite yet, but I am excited.
Okay, you might not have been prepared for this, but you're always prepared for our final segment. Name me a random Dolphins player. It could even be the one from the episode that we didn't air, just because those guys will never get their shine now.
Well, I will not be doing the same one from the episode that didn't air, so you guys will never hear it, ever. Maybe, but you'll never know. But I will go for somebody different. I'm going to pick somebody who had a big game. You picked a 2013 Dolphin last time. I'm not going to say your name in case you're going to use it again.
Yeah, I'll say it this time.
Okay, so I'm picking somebody who had a big game in the same game, I believe, in 2013 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm picking Daniel Thomas. There's my running back pick. I'm picking Daniel Thomas. So that's it. Yeah, that's who I'm going with. I mean, he got overshadowed by over the years, but
the player who he's talking about is Charles Clay, Dolphins legend. Yeah, Daniel Thomas. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Yeah, it came to mind in the middle of the episode because the fact that I knew it was coming, so I had to pick something. And yeah, Daniel Thomas. There don't be surprised if you hear more early to mid 2010s Dolphins over the next couple weeks.
Yes, sir, 100%. We're known as the Trent Sherfield Show. Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. This was so much fun. So glad to be back. So glad that this episode will actually air. Yeah, we're back, trying to get episodes out as often as possible. This is going to be a fun time. I feel like this is where we can this is where I feel like I have way more interest in terms of doing podcasts and stuff, just because during the season, the team can't change that much. In the off season, that's where you can see some real turnover, and that's where you can make some real change. So I'm really excited to see where all that goes. So stay locked in with us, and that's where you can get some great Dolphins content over the course of the year. Follow us on Twitter at FinsFocus. You can follow Tyler at Tyler DeSena or DeSena Sports, and then I'm at Made by Sujay. Subscribe, do all those things. And Tyler, if you have anything you want to shout out, now's the time.
Not much. Just I'll be at the Senior Bowl later this month. Hopefully, we'll bring you guys some draft content then. Gonna try to get more videos out for you guys. You guys have been killing it on the recent video that just came out. So keep killing it. Keep telling us what you want. We'll make sure to get it to you because we really are trying to bring you some of the best Dolphins content on the internet. I hope you guys have a great one.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye.